On November 16, 1951, the morning fog lifted from Portsmouth Harbour as Captain Dennis Campbell ascended the gangway to HMS Illustrious. Inside his briefcase was a single piece of paper, a simple diagram, a tender green angled flight deck. At first glance, nothing revolutionary. But unknown to Captain Campbell, within 18 months, this sketch would save more naval aviators' lives than any weapon system ever designed. What Campbell did know, however, was horrifying. In the past year, the Royal Navy had lost 43 aircraft in landing accidents, 43 planes destroyed, 17 pilots killed, many others maimed. Every single loss happened in the final 30 seconds of flight, that desperate moment when a 30-ton jet traveling at 140 miles in ph tries to catch a wire on a pitching deck, with a steel barricade 60 feet ahead ready to shred any plane that misses. The situation was even worse for the Americans. In 1951, U.S. Navy carrier aviation suffered 776 Class A mishaps, accidents resulting in death or loss of aircraft more than 2 per day. The Korean War had only made things worse. USS Boxer reported 7 barrier crashes in one deployment. Princeton lost 9 planes in just 4 weeks. On straight-deck carriers, missing the arresting wires meant one thing. Either the aircraft slammed into the barricade at full throttle or plowed into the parked planes, creating a fireball that could take out dozens in seconds. The jet age had arrived, but carrier aviation wasn't keeping up. The F-9F Panther landed 40 knots faster than the propeller-driven Hellcat. The jet engines took 7 seconds to spool up from idle, an eternity when sinking toward the ocean at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers stood on the port quarter of the carrier, frantically waving paddles. But by the time a pilot saw he was coming in too low or too fast, physics had already sealed his fate. Every admiral, every engineer, and every test pilot knew the truth. Carrier aviation had reached its breaking point. Jets were the future, but the present was killing people. What Captain Campbell didn't know was that his insane idea would be dismissed, mocked, and called impossible by the very experts whose job was solving impossible problems. But the breakthrough would come not from committees or wind tunnels, but from one man's refusal to accept that good men should die for a design flaw. The problem began in 1945, when Lieutenant Commander William P. Ron made the first jet landing aboard USS Wake Island. His FFR-1 Fireball landed at 90 knots, 20 knots faster than any piston aircraft, and the arresting gear cables screamed under the force. The landing was a success, but the warning went ignored. By 1950, every major navy was facing the same crisis. Jet engines had revolutionized speed and altitude, but their slow throttle response created a deadly trap. On propeller aircraft, pilots could chop the throttle on the landing signal officer's cut signal and fall onto the deck. Jets, however, couldn't do that. They had to land with the engines powered on, maintaining thrust until touchdown because their engines took too long to spool up if they needed to abort the landing. This led to a nightmare. Pilots had to fly their final approach with engines spooled up, committed to landing, unable to climb quickly if they missed the wires. On straight-deck carriers, 4 arresting wires stretched across 60 feet of deck. Behind them was the crash barricade, a web of steel cables designed to catch aircraft that missed. Behind that, rows of parked planes, fuel trucks, ammunition carts, everything needed to turn the flight deck into an active combat zone. The numbers were chilling. A Panther landing at 125 knots covered 211 feet per second. If a pilot missed all 4 wires, he had just 2.1 seconds before hitting the barricade. Sometimes the barricade worked. When it didn't, 30 tons of jet fuel and ordnance slammed into parked aircraft at 100 miles. Captain Bruce Williams, Air Operations Officer aboard USS Kearsarge, witnessed 11 men die when a barrier failed in March 1951. The accident report noted the aircraft hit the barrier at full throttle. The barrier failed, and the aircraft continued forward into 6 parked Corsairs. The resulting fire reached aviation gasoline stores, destroying 14 aircraft and killing 11 personnel with 23 others injured. Carrier operations were suspended for 48 hours. The solution everyone tried: better barriers. The British developed the flex deck, a rubberized landing surface that could theoretically catch jets without landing gear. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown made 40 landings on it at Farnborough and called it fundamentally sound, but bloody terrifying. The Americans developed stronger barricades. The Bureau of Aeronautics spent $3.2 million developing the Davis barrier system, a mechanical web that could stop a $25,000 LB aircraft at full throttle. When it worked, it was impressive, but when it failed, the results were devastating. Yet stronger barriers couldn't prevent crashes, they just contained them. Every senior aviator knew the real problem: the flight deck itself. Captain William T. Raseur, head of aviation military characteristics at the Office of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, wrote in June 1945, "Current landing procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance characteristics. We designed our carriers for propeller aircraft that could land at 70 knots and abort at the last second. Jets land at 130 knots and can't abort. We're trying to land 1952 aircraft on 1942 ships. People will die until we fix this." Everyone agreed. Everyone saw the problem, but no one could solve it. The British tried flex decks. The Americans tried better barriers, backup barriers, and emergency net systems. The French tried reducing aircraft weight. Nothing worked. The accident rate continued to rise. What they needed was someone bold enough to question the one thing nobody had thought to challenge. Why does the landing area have to be parallel to the ship's axis? What they needed was Dennis Campbell. Captain Dennis Royal Farson Campbell wasn't supposed to solve anything. He was a bureaucrat. Born on November 13, 1907, in South Sea, England, Campbell entered the Royal Navy in 1925 as a midshipman. He qualified as a pilot in September 1931, early enough to fly fabric biplanes, yet late enough to realize that naval aviation was not just a gentleman's hobby, but a profession demanding engineering precision. During World War II, he flew Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, obsolete aircraft that nonetheless crippled the Bismarck. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Nobody called him a genius or a visionary. After the war, Admiral T assigned him to the Ministry of Supply as Deputy Chief RN Representative, a desk job managing the technical liaison between the Navy and civilian contractors. He had zero engineering credentials and no advanced degrees. His job was paperwork, managing schedules, attending meetings, and signing requisitions. But Dennis Campbell had one quality that credentials can't teach. He couldn't ignore dead pilots. In 1951, he attended the funeral of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a test pilot killed when his jet hit the barricade on HMS Implacable. Lithgow had been Campbell's student. At 23 years old, Lithgow had made the perfect approach, the perfect speed, but he had floated just 6 feet too far and missed the wires. The barricade failed. Lithgow's aircraft disintegrated. His widow was 5 months pregnant. Campbell stood at that graveside and later told his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is insane. We're murdering them with our own equipment. A pilot does everything right and still dies because 60 feet isn't enough margin for error. There has to be another way." Goodhart didn't expect anything more. Officers say things like that at funerals. But Campbell kept obsessing. He pulled accident reports, interviewed landing signal officers, and studied landing patterns. Not being an engineer, he did what non-engineers often do. He drew pictures. The revelation came during a train ride from Portsmouth to London. Campbell sketched carrier decks in his notebook, trying to visualize how to give pilots more room. If you can't make the landing area longer, make it wider. If you can't make it wider because the ship has a fixed beam, angle it. He drew a flight deck angled 10 to ground to port. Now the landing zone didn't end at the barricade. It ended in open water. A pilot who missed the wires could shove his throttle forward, climb away, and try again. No barricade, no parked aircraft, no catastrophic collision. Just air and ocean and a second chance. The idea was so simple, it felt stupid, which meant either he'd discovered something brilliant or he'd overlooked something obvious that every real engineer already knew. On August 7th, 1951, Captain Dennis Campbell convened a meeting at the Ministry of Supply. In attendance were Louis Bodington, Director of the Naval Air Department at Farnborough, Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Chief of Naval Research, and 6 senior aviation engineers. Campbell opened his briefcase and showed them his sketch. "The room erupted. That is completely illegal," said Commander James, the senior flight operations specialist, without raising his voice. "The International Air Navigation Convention requires all flight operations to align with the vessel's axis. What you're proposing violates a maritime aviation law written after 15 years of carrier operations. This isn't innovation, Captain. It's amateur nonsense." Campbell had expected resistance, but not condescension. "You're asking pilots to land across the ship's natural motion. Carriers pitch and roll around their keel. An angled deck means pilots approach at an angle to that motion. They'll be fighting drift constantly. The landing area will be moving underneath them in ways they can't anticipate. You'll increase crashes, not reduce them." Lieutenant Commander Goodhart started to respond, but Louis Bodington, the civilian engineer from Farnborough, held up his hand. "Show me the math," he said. "I beg your pardon?" Campbell asked. "The math," Bodington repeated. "You say pilots will fight drift. Calculate it. An 8-degree angle on a deck moving through 12-degree rolls. What's the differential drift over a 30-second approach?" Silence. Bodington looked at the other engineers. "Anyone?" Nobody spoke. "Then we test it," Bodington said. "Captain Campbell, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, has a painted outline runway. We can paint an angled deck outline on HMS Triumph's flight deck. In 1 week, we run simulated touch-and-go approaches. If the drift problem is real, we'll measure it. If it's theoretical catastrophizing, we'll know that too." Rear Admiral Slattery leaned back. "Louis, you understand that if you paint an angled deck on Triumph and pilots start crashing, you're ending both your career and Captain Campbell's." "Noted, sir." "And if it works?" Bodington smiled. "Then we stop killing pilots who did everything right." The tests began in September 1951, HMS. Triumph left Portsmouth with an angled deck outlined in white paint across her axial flight deck. Not a structural modification, just paint. For 3 weeks, Navy pilots performed touch-and-go approaches, pretending the painted line was a real deck edge. The predicted drift problem never materialized. Pilots adapted after just 2 landings. What they discovered instead was freedom. Lieutenant Peter Chilton, one of the test pilots, later wrote, "I came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't terrified. I just pushed the power forward and climbed away. No barrier waiting to kill me. No aircraft ahead, just clean air and a second chance. I felt like I'd been given my life back." By October, the painted deck trials proved the concept worked. Now came the challenge, convincing everyone else. Because HMS Triumph was British, but the carrier with the biggest problem was American. The carrier whose pilots were dying at twice the rate of the Royal Navy's was American, and the US Navy didn't take kindly to British officers telling them how to land planes. September 14th, 1951. U.S. Naval Air Test Center, Patuxent River, Maryland. Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown stands in front of 40 American test pilots, feeling every eye in the room, calculating whether to trust him. Brown is the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, the man who has landed more types of aircraft than anyone in history. He holds every British naval aviation record that matters. And right now, none of that matters, because he's about to tell the U.S. Navy that their carriers are designed wrong. "Gentlemen," Brown begins, "in the past 12 months, how many of you have hit the barricade?" 7 hands go up, then 12, then 15. "How many of you know someone who died hitting the barricade?" Every hand goes up. Brown opens his briefcase. "I'm going to show you something the Royal Navy is testing. It's going to sound insane, but I've made 63 landings on it, and I'm standing here instead of being scraped off a deck. So I'm asking you to hear me out. He pins Campbell's diagram to the wall. An aircraft carrier flight deck angled 8 to ground to port. The room erupts. You want us to land sideways. The LSO can't see the approach angle. What about the island? You've moved the landing zone toward the superstructure. Brown waits for the noise to subside. Every objection you just shouted, we had every single one. Then we tested it, and here's what we found. When you miss the wires on an angled deck, you don't die. You throttle up and go around. Simple as that. Commander Harold Buell, commanding officer of VF-84, stands. Commander Brown, I've been landing on carriers since 1943. What you're describing violates every principle we've developed through 8 years of combat operations. You're asking us to throw away proven doctrine for a British theory. I'm asking you to stop dying for a design flaw, Brown replies. The room goes silent. Brown continues, you're landing jets on straight decks because that's what you have. But straight decks were designed for Corsairs and Hellcats that could cut throttle and fall onto the deck. Jets can't do that. So you're forcing 1952 aircraft into 1942 operations, and your people are dying because of it. The angled deck doesn't violate doctrine. It adapts the carrier to match the aircraft. Rear Admiral Apollo Susk, the senior U.S. Navy aviator in London, steps forward. I've observed the Triumph tests. Commander Brown is correct. The concept works. I've recommended to CNO that we run parallel tests on USS Midway. But Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, shakes his head. We're already testing solutions. The Davis barrier has a 98.7% success rate. 98.7% of what? Brown interrupts. Of the aircraft that hit it? What about the pilots who never reach the barrier because they see it coming and panic? What about the ones who deliberately ditch in the ocean rather than risk hitting the barricade at full power? Your statistic measures barrier performance. It doesn't measure pilot survival. The room erupts again. Half the pilots nod, while the other half look ready to throw Brown off the base. Admiral Susk raises his voice. Gentlemen, silence. We will test the angled deck on USS Midway. Paint trials, simulated landings. If it works, we modify one carrier for full structural implementation. If it fails, we bury the idea. But we will not continue losing pilots to a design we can test and potentially fix. Are we clear? The Admiral Pride stands for 10 seconds. He says nothing. Then do Midway trials authorized. But if this British pipe dream causes a single additional casualty, I'm terminating the program and everyone associated with it. Susk nods. Agreed. The meeting ends. Brown packs his briefcase, knowing he's just bet his career on a painted line. What he doesn't know is that within 90 days, the painted line on Midway will work so well that the U.S. Navy will convert USS Antietam into the first true angled deck carrier in the world. If you're fascinated by the moment when one person's courage changed history, make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell icon, because what happened next, when the first pilot landed on Antietam's angled deck, changed naval warfare forever. But first, let me tell you about January 12, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell pulls his F-9F Panther into the landing pattern behind USS Antietam. This is his 43rd carrier landing, but it's his first on an angled deck that's not painted. It's real, an 8-degree sponson extending from the port side, structurally welded to the carrier's hull. Buell doesn't trust it. He's trained his entire career to hit the wires or face the barricade. That fear has saved his life twice. Now they told him to forget it. Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell lowered his landing gear, adjusted trim, and called the ball. Panther ball 3.2, Roger ball. The landing signal officer responded. Buell's approach was perfect until a gust of wind lifted his aircraft 6 feet. He was high. On a straight deck, this is where the LSO would give him a wave-off, and Buell would have to climb away, burn fuel, and try again. But today, the LSO said nothing. Because on an angled deck, being high isn't a catastrophe, it's an opportunity to correct. Buell dropped his nose slightly, bled off the altitude, but now he was too long. He would miss the wires on a straight deck. This is where panic usually sets in, where pilots make desperate corrections that lead to crashes. But Buell forced himself to follow the briefing. If you miss, you climb. The deck was clear. He trusted it. His wheels slammed down. He bounced once. His tail hook skipped over the 1 wire, then the 2 wire, then the 3 wire, and finally the 4 wire. He missed them all. On a straight deck, the barricade would already be tearing his aircraft apart, but there was no barricade, just open deck and clear air. Buell shoved his throttle to full power. His J-48 engine spooled up in 6 seconds. An eternity, but it felt like a gift. The Panther lifted. He was flying again. 23 seconds later, he was back in the pattern. His second approach was perfect. He caught the 3 wire. Buell climbed out of his cockpit shaking, not from fear, but from the relief he didn't even realize he had been carrying for years. He would later write in his autobiography, "To an experienced tailhooker, landing a jet airplane on an angled deck was sheer bliss. For the first time in my career, I wasn't afraid of dying during every approach. The psychological weight that lifted off me that day, I didn't realize I'd been carrying it until it was gone." Over the next 60 days, Carrier Air Group 8 made 1,127 landings on Antietam's angled deck. They recorded 8 bolters, missed wires that required go-arounds. On a straight deck, 8 bolters might have meant 5 barrier crashes, 2 aircraft destroyed and 1 or 2 pilots killed. On the angled deck, 0 crashes, 0 destroyed aircraft, and 0 injuries. The data was undeniable. Before the angled deck from 1950 to 1952, U.S. Navy carrier aviation averaged 647 Class A mishaps per year. Landing accidents accounted for 52% of all losses. After the angled deck implementation from 1955 to 1957, Class A mishaps dropped to 321 per year, with landing accidents accounting for 19% of losses. This represented a 75% reduction in landing accidents and an 80% decrease in barrier-related fatalities. But statistics don't tell the whole story. Lieutenant James Davidson does. On March 8, 1953, Davidson brought his damaged Panther back to Antietam. Hydraulic failure, no flaps, landing speed 20 knots too fast. On a straight deck, he would have ditched in the ocean rather than risk a barrier crash at 145 knots. But Antietam had an angled deck. Davidson made 4 approaches. He missed the wires on every attempt. On the 4th try, he caught the 4 wire, doing 142 knots, the fastest successful carrier landing recorded to that point. His aircraft stopped with just 11 feet of deck remaining. 6 months later, he wrote to Captain Campbell, "Sir, I never met you, but I'm alive to write this letter because you had an idea everyone said was impossible. My daughter was born last month. I got to be there because you refused to accept that good pilots should die for bad design. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you." The British implemented angled decks on the Ark Royal in 1955, the French converted Clemenceau, and the Australians modified Melbourne. By 1957, every major aircraft carrier in the Western world either had an angled deck or was being retrofitted with one. The Soviets initially rejected the concept, but in 1959, after a series of catastrophic landing accidents on their straight-deck carrier, Varyag, they quietly implemented it. Soviet naval records declassified in 1993 show that landing accidents dropped 68% within 6 months. But the most powerful testimony comes from pilots themselves. Captain John Moore, who flew combat missions over Vietnam from USS Coral Sea, said, "I made 947 carrier landings between 1954 and 1973. I bolted, missed all the wires 62 times on a straight deck. That's 62 potential barrier crashes. 62 chances to die or kill the sailors working forward. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again." Every pilot my age has a moment when we think about the friends who died in the 50s, hitting barricades. We're alive because Dennis Campbell drew a line on a piece of paper and refused to shut up about it. By 1975, the angled deck was so ubiquitous that young pilots didn't even know carriers used to be designed differently. It wasn't an innovation anymore. It was just how carriers worked. The revolution was complete when it became invisible. The angled deck saved thousands of lives, but Dennis Campbell never sought fame for it. In fact, what he did after the breakthrough might surprise you even more. But before we get to that, if you know a veteran or someone who loves military history, share this video with them. These stories matter. Now here's what happened to the man who changed carrier aviation forever. Captain Dennis Campbell never gave a press interview about the angled deck. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1954. He attended the ceremonies when HMS Ark Royal launched, the first carrier in the world designed from the keel up with an angled deck. Reporters asked him for comments. He directed them to Louis Boddington and the engineers at Farnborough. When the U.S. Navy invited him to the commissioning of USS Forrestal in 1955, the first American supercarrier equipped with an angled deck, steam catapults, and optical landing aid, Campbell sent his regrets. He was attending a funeral for a Royal Navy lieutenant killed in a training accident. Not a carrier accident, eh? He was attending a funeral for a Royal Navy lieutenant killed in a helicopter crash, unrelated to anything Campbell had worked on. But the lieutenant had served under him in 1943, and Campbell believed in always attending the funerals of your people. In 1957, Admiral T awarded him the CBE, Commander of the British Empire, for his services to naval aviation. The citation was 2 sentences long. Campbell kept it in a drawer. He retired from the Royal Navy in 1960 and took up a position as a technical consultant for Hawker Siddeley Aviation, working on the development of vertical takeoff jets. Colleagues recall him as obsessively focused on pilot safety, often frustrating designers by insisting on adding unnecessary redundancies to cockpit systems. Dennis would slow down every design review, recalled engineer Anthony Marsh, asking questions like, what happens if this fails at night in bad weather? If we'd tell him the odds of that failure were 1 in 10,000, he'd ask, what does the pilot do when it happens? He never cared about odds. He cared about the one pilot who got unlucky. Campbell died on April 6, 2000, at the age of 92. His obituary in the Times was 4 paragraphs long, while The Guardian published 6. Both mentioned the angled deck, but neither truly captured its significance. What it meant was this: every carrier landing since 1953 happens because one pilot refused to accept that colleagues should die preventably. Today, every aircraft carrier in the world, American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, and Russian, uses an angled deck. The U.S. Navy's newest Gerald R. Ford-class carriers feature advanced electromagnetic catapults and arresting gear, but the deck is still angled 8 degrees to port, exactly as Campbell drew it in 1951. Modern carrier pilots make over 15,000 landings per year across the U.S. Navy's fleet alone. The bolter rate is approximately 8%. That's 200 missed wire approaches annually. Without the angled deck, those would be 1/200 potential barrier crashes. How many lives saved? Hundreds per year. Over 70 years, tens of thousands. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black, U.S. Marine Corps, who flew FA-18s off carriers from 1985 to 2007, tracked down Campbell's family in 2003 and sent them a letter. It read, I never met your father, but I made 147 carrier landings during my career. I bolted 142 times, missed all the wires, and had to go around on a straight deck. That's 142 times I might have died. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again. Your father gave me 142 second chances. He gave me a career. He gave me a life. On behalf of every carrier pilot who lived because of him, thank you. Dennis Campbell never responded to that letter. He had been dead for 3 years, but his son framed it because his father never kept his own awards. But he would have kept that letter. The lesson was clear. Some breakthroughs don't come from the experts. They come from the person who refuses to accept "that's how we've always done it" as an answer. Captain Campbell wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a test pilot. He was a bureaucrat who couldn't ignore dead friends and had the audacity to draw a simple line on paper and ask, why not? The angled deck saved more lives than any Medal of Honor recipient. It revolutionized naval warfare more than nuclear power or guided missiles. But it didn't come from committees or laboratories. It came from a train ride, a notebook, a sketch, and the refusal to shut up when everyone said it was impossible. That's the real story. That's why it matters. Because the next Dennis Campbell might not be an admiral or an engineer, might not have credentials or degrees, but might be someone who sees a problem everyone accepts and refuses to accept it. History doesn't always belong to the loudest voices or the highest ranks. Sometimes it belongs to the one person who won't let good people die for bad design.